So welcome back to this new module. So from this module onwards, we are going to build this particular counter application. So whenever I click on this increase button, you can see the color of this particular circle is actually changed to green, which is actually a container. And whenever the value is actually smaller than 0, then you can see the color actually changes to red. And if the value is 0, then it's going to display nothing, just a simple shadow to this particular container, which is actually a circular form, to display the counter value. So we will build this particular application that follow a black theme and a white text and this particular structure of the application. So the first step is to start with the HTML part of the project. Now for the saving of the time, I have already created the files inside the Visual Studio Code, which is index.html, style.css and script.js file. And also I have launched this project, you can see inside the browser, with the name of counter web application, and I have also launched the final version of the application that we want to build. So the first step is we need to actually create the container division. Instead of that, everything will be presented. So if I use the shortcut like container and press a tab key, it automatically completes the code because of the emit extension inside the Visual Studio Code. And after that, inside the container, we need to create the another division that will be act as a card. Okay, so that is a card, and inside of the card, first we need to place a heading element. So I'm also going to give the class to this particular heading element as a heading, and then the content that we want to display inside of this one, which is counter application. After displaying the heading, then we need to create the another division. And this division is going to have a class counter, and inside of the counter we need to create the another h1 element that will be used to display the counter value. So I'm going to give the class as a different name, which is counter machine. Okay, will be a machine. Okay, and then the default value that I want to display is the 0. All right, so that is for the card. And after completing the counter division, make sure you are outside of this particular division. So division, here we need to create the another division for the button groups. And also I'm going to name this particular division element a class of name btn group. So this is the btn, and instead of that we need to create the two buttons. So the first button is, which is like having a class btn, and I'm going to specify the btn counter. Then it is actually a decrease btn. Alright, then I'm going to duplicate it by pressing the shift alt and down arrow key to create a duplicate copy of this particular line of the code. Then this one is for the increase button. Okay, and the text that I want to display inside of this button is actually a decrease and increase. So this first one is for the decrease of the counter value. The second one is for the increase of the counter value. Means whenever we click on this particular button, we want to decrease the value, and when we click on this particular button, we want to increase the value. Alright, so that marks the completion of the HTML part for this particular project, which is the counter web application. Now in the next part, we're going to start with the CSS part of the project. So now it's time to start with the CSS part of the project. So for that, we need to use the style.css file. Instead of that, first I need to select the body element, and then we have to do some changes inside the default styling of the CSS of the browser. So the first thing is we want to set the padding to 0. So padding is going to be have 0, and then we need to reset the margin also, which is going to be 0, and then we need to use the box sizing, which is going to be border box. And after that, we need to apply the background. So here we will be using the background. So we want to use the linear gradient function. It is going to be like to right. So this will be the color that will be used for the gradient, which is the first color, and then the second color we want is this one. We control save it, then we get this black theme color. Okay, or you can say that the gray color of the gradient. After that, we need to set the display to flex, and then we need to set the align items to the center, and then we need to set the justify content to also center. And after that, we need to provide the minimum height, which is going to be 100 VH. So now you can see everything is actually at the center of the screen, or you can say that the browser. Alright, so that marks the completion of the code for the body element. Then we need to select the container, and then to start its block of the code. So the first thing is we need to set the display to flex, and after that we need to set the align items to the center. So then we need to set the justify content to the center as well, and after that we need to set the height to 100%. Alright, so this is for the container element, and then we need to set the card element, the code inside the card element. So the first thing is we need the background, then the linear gradient function. Okay, and then we need to set the bottom one here, and then we need to provide the two colors, which is hash 222, and then the another color, which is hash 444. So if I control save it, now you can see we get the color to our card container. Alright, then we need to provide the border radius. So border radius is going to be like 10 pixel, and after that we need to provide the box shadow. The box shadow is going to 0, then 4 pixel, and then we need to provide the 8 pixel, and then the value, which is RGBA value, which is 0 0. Okay, so I have to add here 0 as well. So I'm going to remove it again, and then again I will be using the RGBA. So 0 0, and then the alpha is going to 0.1. Alright, and after that I'm going to provide the padding. So padding is going to be like 30 pixel. Alright, and after that I want to provide the text alignment center. If I do that, now you can see everything will be presented at the center of the card container. Then we need to define the width. So width is going to be like 300 pixel. Now you can see it's almost looks like the final version of the application except the text. So now which is the next thing that we want to style. So we have to select here the heading. So like our heading here, and also we need to select the counter machine. So counter machine, which is actually this particular container value, that is a counter in which the value will be updated. So the first thing is we need to set the color. So color that I want is the white version of the color. You can see now the color is changes to white, and then we need to actually do one more thing here. So here we need to actually set the margin to 0. You can see everything is actually very close to each other, but we will actually fix it. So first we need to set here the container, means the counter, the actual counter. If I come back to the index version of the HTML, means index.html. So we are going to apply the style to this particular counter, which is actually the container for this particular h1 element. Alright, so first we are going to set the value to that particular counter heading value. Okay, so we are going to here use the background color, then 3 times 3. Alright, and after that we need to provide some bunch of more code here. So the first thing is here border radius. So border radius is going to be like 50%. Alright, and then we need to provide the padding. So padding is going to like 20 pixel, not 30, it is actually 20 pixel. You can see now there is spaces between these elements is actually now increased because the padding is applied to the counter container. Then we need to provide the margin from top and bottom to 20 pixel, and from left and right it is going to like auto. Right, and then we need to provide the width. So width is going to like 100 pixel, and then we need to provide the height like 100 pixels, so that we get this rounded thing to this particular counter container, which is actually a division tag. Okay, and then we need to provide the display to flex, so that we can actually arrange the elements at the center of the screen. Then we need to use the align items to center as well, and after that we need to use the justify content to be center. Now you can see the value, which is the h1 element, is actually now presented at the center of the counter container. After that I need to increase the font So I will be using here a 24 pixel font size, which will actually increase the font of the h1 element, which is actually the counter value that will be updated by using the JavaScript. Then I want a border, which is actually a 2 pixel border. So it is like solid. And then I want to display here a transparent. So once I did that, right now it's actually transparent. But once we are inside the JavaScript, we are going to update the border dynamically by using the JavaScript code. And then we need to apply the transition to the border so that there is a smooth transition between the border color. So we are going to use here a border color property, and then we need to provide the 0.5 as that is the duration of the transition. Alright, now it's time to apply the style code for the button, which is actually a btn group. So I'm going to copy the class name, which is the btn group. Coming back to the style.css, so here I will be using a dot operator because it is a class selector. If you are familiar with the fundamentals of the CSS, inside of the button group, first I need to select the display, means I need to set the display to flex. Then again we need to use the justify content to space between, so that you can see we need to use a space between. So there is a space between these two elements because I want to display the decrease and increase at the left and right side of the container. That is why I have used here a space between. Alright, then I need to provide the margin to these two elements. So I will be using here a margin top to 10 pixel. Okay, so that is for the btn group. Now it's time to apply the hover code for the btn, or I can say first I need to apply the btn counter. Is whenever we click on it, so if I come back to the index.html, so we are going to apply the color code for the btn counter. So btn counter, I copy the name of the class, right? Then I will be here using the dot and then pasting the name of the class, then starting its block of the code, which is actually a btn counter. So first thing is I need to change the background color. So background color is going to like 007BFF, which will actually gives the blue color. Then I need to remove the border. So for removing the border, we need to set the border to none. Now you can see the border is actually removed. After that, we need to apply the border radius to 5 pixel. And then we need to apply the color. So color is going to be like white color. Okay, so this is a white color. Then you can see now the color is actually changed. Alright. And after that, we need to use the cursor to pointer. And then we need to use the padding to 8 pixel, and from left and right it is going to be 12 pixel. And then we need to apply the transition property. So transition, it is going to be like background color, and then the duration of the transition, which is going to be the 0.3s. Alright, so this is for the btn counter. Now we need to apply a hover effect to this button. So we need to copy the class name btn counter and closing its block of the code, and after that we need to here use this pseudo class element, which is the hover element. Alright, and after that we need to apply here a background color. So background color, so I want a darker version of the blue color, so 00F56 or B3 will be the color code name. Now if I hover it, then you can see now we get the darker version of the color. Alright, now we need to actually provide two more CSS style code. The first one is for the positive. So it is like a positive. So this will basically change the background color, or I can say that the border color of this particular card division. Or I can say that the counter division, not a card division. Yes, it is actually a counter division. So this CSS code will be used inside the JavaScript. Alright. So that is the reason we are going to type it here first, so that once we start the JavaScript part, we didn't need to come back to this CSS part again for the code of the CSS. So for positive one, I want to display a green color. And similarly, we also want a negative color. Means the class name should be negative. Once the value is actually smaller than 0, then we want to display the red color. So here I will be using the red color. Okay, so that marks the completion of the code for the entire CSS part for this particular counter web application. Now in the next part, we are going to start with the JavaScript part of the project, and you can see that whenever I press the Ctrl S, you will see there is a border to this particular container. Alright, that is what we want. the border color of the container is actually black, but we are going to set it by using these two buttons. So if the value of the 0 is decreased, then it's going to display the red border color, and when the value of the counter is actually increased, means greater than 0, then it's going to display the green border color. Alright, so we are going to do all of this stuff in the next part of this particular application, which is the counter web application. So now it's time to start with the JavaScript part for the counter web application. So for that we need to use the script.js file. So here first I'm going to use the round bracket. Instead of that we are going to use here a self invoke function. So I will be here using the function keyword. Then we need to define the body of the particular function. Alright, so this is actually a self invoke function, and we also want to call this particular function. So here we actually call this function as well. Now inside of this particular self invoke function body, we need to first get the buttons. So here we need to create the const, then the buttons. So inside of that, first we need to get the button. So we're going to use a document dot query selector all. So there are two buttons. So that is the reason we want to select here a query selector all. Then we need to define the type of the selector. So it is actually a class selector. So that is the reason we have added here a dot. Then we need to define the name of the class, which is the button counter. So if I come back to the index.html, you can see this is the button counter. We are actually targeting every button counter. That is the reason we have used here a query selector all. And also we need to define the type of the selector. So for that we have specified the dot. Then the value that we want to display, which is actually a count. So I'm going to initialize it to 0. Now I have used here a let. The reason for that, because the value will be updated multiple times. And after that, for displaying the value, we want to get the reference of this particular heading element. So for that we need to create here another const. So const, then this will be like our counter. Alright, again we need to here use the document dot query selector, because right now it is actually a single selector. So that is the reason I have used here a query selector. And then we need to use here a dot and then the class name. So if I come back to the index.html, so the class name is counter machine, because inside of that particular h1 element we want to display the value of this particular let variable, which is actually a count variable. So here I will be pasting the name of the class, which is counter machine. And after that, in order to actually change the border color of this particular, so it is actually a counter container. So if I come back to the index.html, you can see it is actually a counter container. So we need to get the reference of this particular also, so that we can change the color when the value of the counter is actually 0 or greater than 0, means when the value of this particular is actually smaller than or greater than 0. Okay, so for again here we need to create the const. Then this one is actually a counter container. Okay, and then we need to use here a document dot query selector. Right now it is also a single one, so that is the reason I have here specified the name query selector. Then we need to specify the type of the selector. So it is actually a class selector, so we need to use the dot, and then I'm going to paste the name of the class, which is the counter. So now we have get the reference to all of them. Again it's time to actually use the buttons, means I will be here using the for each loop, so that we can actually listen to the events of the button. We can add the events to the button, and also we are going to listen to that particular events inside the button. Okay, so that is the reason here I will be using the buttons dot for each, because it will make our life easier and we have to write very less code. So here I will be using a function. Instead of that I will be passing the button, which is a counter for the for each one, and I can go with the anonymous one, but this is actually I will be using the function keyword. Then we need to start its body. Now I will be adding some spaces here so that we have some space to write the code. And after that we're going to set the listener. So we will be using this one to set the listener, which is button dot add event listener. Instead of that we want to listen to the click event. Alright, and then we want to invoke a function. It is a function, and then again we need to start its body, and then we need to terminate that also. Okay, and here Instead of that, we need to check for the condition whether the button class list contain a decrease button. So we want to listen to that also. So if here we will be using the condition if button dot class list. So when we click on the button, we want to actually check for its class list. So we are going to use the contains method and we want to listen to its class. So that is the reason we have actually specified the class's name as decrease btn. So if it is decrease btn, then what we want to do, we actually want to decrement the value of the count variable, that is this particular variable. So we want to decrement its value, and else if also we can use the else condition, but we already set the default color, means the default state transparent inside the style.css. So that is the reason we don't need to use the else block for these particular conditions. We can check for the increase and decrease button class list whether it's a decrease or increase. So here I will be changing it to increase btn. So if it is the increase btn, then we want to update its value to actually increment its value to the positive side, which is actually greater than 0. So if I control save it, now if I click it, you will see nothing will be happen here, because we want to also update this particular HTML element on the basis of this variable value. So for that, we need to actually use this counter variable. Okay, so this counter will be used. So it is like counter. So we want to update its text content, and then it is actually equal to the count variable value. Now if I control save it, and now if I click on the decrease button, still you can see nothing is actually happening here. So if I actually check for the console, so if I actually decrease this window size, and if I press the F12 key here, so you can see whenever I click on the button, we will get this error. So decrease is not defined. So if I click on this particular one, or I can just simply, so here is actually giving the problem unquote reference, decrease is not defined. So actually I have to wrap this inside the double quotes or in the single quotes. So that is the reason it's actually giving the problem here. Also for the increase btn. Now if I control save it, and if I close the console window, now you can see the counter is actually functioning properly. We are getting the negative value. Also when we increase it, we are getting the positive value. So now the functionality is implemented, means the value for the counter is actually updated. So the next step is we need to actually give this color effect, which is actually the border color. So we want to also apply the conditions. So coming back after the counter, once we are setting the value to the counter and also opening the other version of the application, which is this particular one. Right now the border color is not changing to red when the value is actually smaller than 0. And similarly, when the value is greater than 0, we want to change the border color to green, not background color. We want to change the border color to green. Alright, so for that we need to check for the condition. If the value of the counter, like this count variable value, not counter, if the value of the count variable is actually greater than 0, then we want to update the counter container. So this is the counter container. We want to actually update its class list, but before that we need to remove the class list. So if it is a case of the increment, like the value is actually greater than 0, then we want to remove the negative class, which is actually the negative class for this particular CSS. So the negative class, we want to first remove the class list element negative from the counter container, and we want to set the positive one. Alright, and similarly we need to check for the else if condition. So else if condition, and if the value of the count is actually smaller than 0, then we want to do the reverse of these two things. We want to remove the positive CSS means the positive value, and we want to set the negative one, which is the negative CSS. So if the value is smaller than 0, we want to remove the positive class from the counter container, and then we need to set the negative class to the counter container. Now here we need to use the add method instead of remove, and similarly for this one we need to use the add method. Now if I control save it and if I click on the decrease button, now you can see the color is changes to red. And now if I actually come back to the 0, we actually want to display the default color, which is the default style, which is we're actually getting it by using this particular code. Alright, so we need to fix this particular error. Also, let's check whether the color is changes to green. So now the color is doesn't changes to green. Okay, so the color is actually changing to red, but it is not changes to green. Okay, if I refresh it, now if I, so the green color functionality is actually not working here. I need to check for the spellings here. Okay, so here the spelling mistake is actually here. I made a typo, so it is actually a positive. And now if I control save it, now you can see the color is changes to green. If I refresh it, now if I increase the value, you can see now the border color changes to green. And now if I decrease the value, the color is now changes to red. But the problem is that in the default, once the value is 0, we want to actually come back to the default state of the color. Alright, and also if I increase it and now if I try to decrease it, then still it's actually freeze in the green version of the color. So for that we need to use here the else block. Instead of that, we need to remove all the CSS. Means we need to remove the counter container class list. So this is the class list, that is this one. So we want to remove all the class list, means all the CSS, which is the positive one and also the negative one. Now if I control save it, if I now decrease the value, you can see it changes to red. Also the value of the counter updated. Now if I come back to the Australia, it's actually showing the red version of the color, but now if I come back to 0, still it's giving the problem. Okay, so there is another typo I have made it here. Actually, I need to close it like this and like this. Now if I control save it, if I now decrease the value to red, it's now changes its color. Now if I come back to 0 again, now you can see it's actually come back to its default state. Similarly, if I increase the value and now if I decrease the value, now you can see it's actually come back to its default state, which is the default when the application first loads to the browser. Okay, so that marks the completion of the code for this entire counter web application. So if you like this module, then leave your review, because your review definitely motivates me to create more awesome courses for you. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you very much.